My presentation will be somewhat more secular, and so I guess in secular terms, and in the terms that are relevant to this debate, the question would be, can beauty save the democratic public sphere? And I think for 2/3 of my presentation I will struggle with that question, and finally I won't say no, because I would rather discuss it with you what the answer is, but I will give some somewhat skeptical observations on that, and then you can decide how far to go with them. So what I'm trying to do today is talk a little bit on why it is that art could matter for the public sphere, what it is that makes the sphere of art and aesthetic experience relevant for the public. Then I will talk a little bit about theoretical obstacles to that way of conceptualizing the world and the links between art and politics. And then some more historical observations on, again, shortcomings of that project. And the final part will be a reflection on the state of contemporary fine arts. I will not talk about literature, or it will be mostly on visual art and fine art. On what is it? So the relevance of those previous observations for the state of contemporary art, and how far could contemporary art contribute to resurrecting the public sphere, etc. So the first part of my talk will be very much going into some of the debates famous around the Enlightenment on the role of artists in politics. And the author I'm most thinking about here is Kant, who talks a lot in the third critique about the role of aesthetic judgment and the analogies between aesthetic judgment and political judgment. What makes that book particularly interesting is that there is a discussion on why aesthetic experience allows citizens to develop and to take up their, say, citizen obligations, to be good citizens. And the reasons Kant thought that aesthetic experience was relevant is that when enjoying works of art, those who enjoy the works of art come together free from prejudices, free from interests, and happy to share their opinions on matters of taste without really, we would say, needing to push a point. So, disinterested way. And so Kant thought that that model of aesthetic judgment, which we inevitably express when we enjoy works of art, is a good model to look at when we reflect about how citizens of an enlightened public should reflect on political institutions. That is, citizens should be open-minded, unprejudiced, and impartial. So Kant thought that the three, what he called the three maxims that illustrate the claims of taste, are similar to the maxims that should guide political judgment. And the other interesting element was that Kant thought that whenever we assess a work of art, we don't really want people to, we cannot really rely on people agreeing with us. So when I say I enjoy Picasso's Guernica, say, in a way I expect you to share my judgment, but then I don't really have reasons to share that judgment, because we realize that it's also very much of a subjective experience. So what makes aesthetic judgment interesting is that it's this double expectation. On the one hand, we know that we're expressing subjective judgments, but on the other hand, we would like to have universal agreement. And those of you who know about deliberative democracy and democratic ideals of speech, etc., know that it's exactly that is the model to which deliberative Democrats look at. And so Kant thought that, for these reasons, the claims of taste, the sphere of taste and aesthetic judgment, was a model to look at, and Schiller pursues that point in the Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, where he really ascribes a kind of emancipatory mission to the artist. And, you probably know that he writes this when the French Revolution was at its most wild stage, so terror was everywhere. Political institutions were either tyrannizing in the name of democracy or resisting change, again, because it violated people's freedom of expression, this and that. So when Schiller wrote the Letters for the Aesthetic Education of Man, he looked at this, he was writing in a time of crisis of political institutions, time of political corruption, and he said, well, let's look at the role of artists. So what art does is it tries to mediate between the sphere of feelings and what is the sensuous experience and that of moral ideals. And it does that in a soft way. It doesn't really, try to persuade you by using force. It doesn't coerce you into accepting certain views. It just does it in a softer way so that you are progressively motivated to then care about abstract ideals of freedom, equality, justice, things that we can't rely on everyone sharing in the same time. This very nice narrative that I brought forward to you is really characteristic of much of the Enlightenment thought. And the title of my paper, which is Public Spaces and the Death of Art, was Hegel right, points at the moment in the history of philosophy in which that narrative kind of breaks down. And, artists are really criticized. And much of the way in which art develops after that are attempts to struggle with that reaction to this kind of Enlightenment way of thinking about the role of art and the mission of artists in society, etc. Hegel said that he wrote in his Aesthetics, agreeing with much of what Kant and Schiller said about how aesthetic experience has this mediating function between feelings and moral imperatives. He concludes the Aesthetic by saying, notwithstanding all these positive elements, art is for us a thing of the past. And that is the famous end of art thesis that then has been referred to for a long time from a lot of contemporary artists, etc. Now, what Hegel meant when he said that art was a thing of the past and we could not expect from art to be a kind of sensible revelation of what matters conceptually, what he meant by that was not so much that there would be no more artistic production, and the obvious counterclaim there would be that when Hegel wrote that art was dead, Goethe was writing Faust. So obviously, from kind of empirical perspective, that doesn't really hold. But what he meant was that modern society somehow introduced this fragmentation and particularization such that the unity that one could look for in art was just not there anymore. And then a lot of sociologists, and Weber, etc., further discussed this concept, and what emerged from their narrative of modernity was that in a time of commercialization, then further developments, times of technological reproduction, digital reproduction of works of art, modernization, processes of separation in the workplace, etc., that kind of narrative of the Enlightenment just didn't hold anymore. Those who were sympathetic to art and to the kind of contribution that art was making there said, well, fine, so if art can't do the job that was assigned to it from the Enlightenment, if art cannot reflect philosophy anymore, let art become philosophy. And so there you have all the aesthetic experiences, and this was the part that was relevant to my talk today, is the experiences of the historical avant-garde, who said, let's take away art from the domain of consumer culture, and that domain had characterized much of artistic production during much of the Enlightenment, and let's formalize it so that we save it somehow from this kind of banalization and trivialization of art, etc. And all of you, I guess, are familiar with the whole Lukács Adorno debate. On the one side, you have Adorno, who was very much a pioneer of this line of thinking, and said, was very much in favor of formalization in art. And then on the other hand, Lukács, who was holding to this kind of ideal of the Enlightenment and emancipatory function. Now, what I wanted to suggest today is that it seems to me that history has somehow given reason to Lukács rather than Adorno, because what happened with contemporary art ever since this avant-garde development was that it did not really play the emancipatory function that it had tried to play by attempting to replace philosophy. It didn't necessarily convey progressive messages. It was simply distant from the public, and people weren't really understanding what was going on. So what was contemporary art production about? And a lot of the experiences that have accompanied the historical avant-gardes of the 20s and 30s, and also the history of the decline of avant-garde, shows precisely that this kind of attempt of formalization, separating from lay life, from lay people lives, introducing very sharp distinction between consumer culture and high culture, actually didn't succeed in obtaining the result that the historical avant-gardes wanted to obtain with it, which was to make art even more relevant. Now, the reason why I talked about historical avant-gardes is that in the last 20 or 30 years, a lot of the artistic production, contemporary artistic production, has gone back to a number of techniques, art techniques that were used by historical avant-gardes. So there has been a return of conceptual art, pop art, fluxus, performance art. Installations is another attempt to mediate between the reproduction, digital reproduction, and the sphere of original art production. But what happens is that there are two really interesting developments, and two developments that really distinguish the contemporary fine art scene from the historical avant-garde stuff, even though there is this going back to the techniques of avant-garde. The first one is that these contemporary art productions aren't necessarily political. And the reason why they're not political is that they endorse a kind of aesthetic theory that is unfortunately very much against the kind of political theories that inspire democratic, deliberative democratic debates, which is they endorse a whole narrative of postmodernity that makes it so that it's worthless to seek for meaning. There are no ideals, it's all, life is meaningless. And their works of art really attempt to give that message, but without necessarily a political or even emancipatory function motivating their production. And this is even more relevant because in the realm of contemporary art production, you will all have experienced going in a museum and observing contemporary art and not understanding what it is about. Or you just, see something very trivial and you wonder, and I mean, I don't know if I can generalize my experience, but sometimes you're there and you're watching something and you think, well, maybe, what does it mean? I'm not so sure, I need to read something about it to find out. So it doesn't strike you anymore in the same way in which classic art would have struck you. It doesn't necessarily convey a message in the same complete way. So what happens in contemporary art production is that contemporary art production and artists themselves need aesthetic theory. In order to make sense of their works of art, you cannot distinguish between the two. And this is so much so that theorists such as, say, Arthur Danto, who is one of the most famous aestheticians, are also curators of biennales and exhibitions and museums, etc., because you cannot distinguish these two moments anymore. You have to be a critic in order to understand. You cannot understand the work without being a critic or without having a kind of theoretical background. Now, where that becomes a problem is that the theories that these contemporary artists endorse are, as I said, very much in line with the postmodern destruction of, Enlightenment ideals of emancipation, political function, etc. And so that makes it very, very difficult to convey progressive messages. The second difficulty that I think I was very interested in discussing with you is that in this constructing this narrative of freedom, rejection of ideals of rationality, rejection of guidance to society, etc., art creates this apparent idea that it's a sphere of freedom, it's a sphere of independence where you can say what you want, etc. In the end, this becomes conventional itself, and so you realize that a lot of art productions, even though they're all trying to convey this message, are very conventional in that they're all the same somehow. And this is obviously, that makes them even more vulnerable to being subject to then interference from other powerful actors of society, because they've lost this kind of social critique function that they perform. They become even more vulnerable to being dominated by powerful multinational corporations and governments trying to use biennales, for example, to legitimize themselves. This was the case with a couple of years ago. There was a biennale in Istanbul in which the Turkish government was really using the biennale as a show for its willingness to join the EU, being a democratic country, open to arts, open to discussion, etc. And the other really interesting new development is the mix between fashion design and contemporary art. I don't know how many of you travel on intercontinental planes. I happened to watch in one of these planes going to the US a few years ago a film called The Devil Wears Prada. And the message of that film was very much that there is a fusion between contemporary artistic production and fashion design. Artists are often also photographers for, contemporary artists are also photographers for these big fashion design companies. Sometimes they are trying to campaign for fashion designs in museums. So in Berlin a couple of years ago there was a Max Mara exhibition in front of the Staatsbibliothek. I don't know if you have, it was all coats and Max Mara productions of the last 50 years, and that was a work of art, or it was conveyed as a work of art. Another, for example, another Japanese contemporary artist, Murakami, is also a photographer for Louis Vuitton. So you see this fusion between contemporary art and fashion design, which is not necessarily what one would have hoped for. Or, I mean, I don't want to express too abstract judgments about that, but there may be reasons to worry about that. And so, where are we left from there? Obviously, there are all the contemporary productions that my previous co-panelists mentioned, and these, attempts to reconstruct public spaces outside of the institutional sphere of museums and biennales, where it seems they have also become subject to this privatization, multinational invasion, etc. But that is, of course, very difficult because of some of the reasons that were mentioned already, which is finances, and you have to somehow pay for your activities, etc. So I think I will conclude by saying that one difficulty, it seems to me, with when discussing about contemporary art and the role of art in the public sphere, is that there has been this. Now we are at a point in history of aesthetic evaluation in which there is this theoretical assessment of contemporary art, which is very much influenced by postmodern ideals, and then on the other hand, the sphere of art production, which is dominated by private companies, etc., and no real resources for critical mobilization against that, precisely because the narrative of enlightenment, progress, etc., that nourished these critical resources isn't there anymore. And so I guess my bottom line would be, go back to Kant, but then one has to start with thinking again about what art means, what the function of art in society is, and perhaps with somewhat more skepticism towards the postmodern narrative and the postmodern critique of the Enlightenment. Thank you.